The Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's domestic agenda. That phrase, that term, the Great Society, comes from a speech that the president gave at the University of Michigan. He actually tested out the term at Ohio University a couple weeks before, but he really introduces the idea of the Great Society at the University of Michigan's graduation ceremony in 1964. Let's take a listen to what he said.
The challenge of the next half century is whether we have the wisdom to use that wealth to enrich and elevate our national life and to advance the quality of our American civilization. Your imagination and your initiative and your indignation will determine whether we build a society where progress is the servant of our needs, or a society where old values and new visions are buried under unbridled growth. For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the Great Society. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
We heard President Johnson there mention racism and mention poverty, two pillars that he's going to try to attack with the Great Society. Let's look first at what he did on racial discrimination. One of the first things that LBJ accomplishes is he quickly gets Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act that John F. Kennedy had proposed a year before. In fact, it's an expanded version of JFK's Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, remember, is the one that bans segregation in public facilities, including hotels and restaurants. One of the things people forget sometimes is it gave additional power to the federal government to enforce school desegregation, which 10 years after Brown versus Board was slow to take effect in many parts of the country. It also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to fight employment discrimination. Continuing on working for the rights and needs of African Americans, LBJ and Congress helped ratify the 24th Amendment, which abolished poll taxes, one of the means used to keep black voters from voting. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed by Congress with LBJ's support and encouragement. It should be noted that this law is a direct result of Martin Luther King's campaign in Selma, Alabama for black voting rights. This is the law that eliminates literacy tests. And it does something else very important. It gives the federal government the power to oversee states with a history of racial discrimination in voting, and even counties and voting districts with a history of racial discrimination in voting. In those places, if any voting laws are going to be changed for the next 40 years, for the next almost 60 years, they're going to need pre-approval from the federal government to make any changes in many southern states, to make any changes to their voting rights laws. Continuing on ending racial discrimination, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was also signed by Johnson, seen up there in the right. This is the law that bans racial discrimination in housing. And LBJ is also the first president to have an African American serving on his cabinet. The Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Housing and Urban Development's first secretary was Robert Weaver, who was African American. Let's move next to LBJ's goals of eradicating poverty in America. A lot of what LBJ says about poverty, a lot of what politicians are doing about poverty in the 1960s grew out of a very popular book there on the left, The Other America by Michael Harrington, Poverty in the United States. This book really draws attention to the fact that in 1962, 40 million Americans, more than 20% of the country, were living below the poverty line. President Johnson, in the State of the Union in 1964, says this.
Unfortunately, many Americans live on the outskirts of hope. Some because of their poverty, and some because of their color, and all too many because of both. Our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity. And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
So similar to with civil rights, there are things to do from JFK's administration that Johnson does early on after he takes over. He's elevated from vice president to president, and one of the first things he does is get Congress to pass JFK's proposed income tax cut. And many economists would agree that this was a good thing for the U.S. economy. You can see there on the graph that unemployment rates fell in part due to these tax cuts. But LBJ didn't stop there. He asks Congress for and gets Congress to create the Office of Economic Opportunity. They give that new federal office a $1 billion budget to combat poverty in America. And they create a variety of programs like Head Start, the federally government-funded preschool that's provided by the federal government for low-income families. He gets, or the Office of Economic Opportunity creates Job Corps, which provides vocational education and literacy programs and even free legal services to adults in poverty. Housing being one of the biggest expenses for people, housing was addressed to help the poor. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, was created, and they increased funding on public housing. They increased rent subsidies that were available to low-income Americans. Continuing on the war on poverty, LBJ gets Congress to pass the Food Stamp Act of 1964. Now, there already was a program to provide federally funded food and other necessities. This is going to expand that program to help poor people buy food and other necessities. Now, we don't call them food stamps anymore, but this program still exists in the form of SNAP. Overall, looking at all the programs, and we didn't mention all of them, just some of the big ones, that war on poverty that's part of LBJ's Great Society really has a lot of success. From 1962, when that book was published, The Other America, 22% of Americans were living in poverty at that time. By the end of the decade, that's down to only 13%. However, a lot of these anti-poverty programs are scaled back or cut entirely to have to pay for the Vietnam War. Remember, wars are expensive. There are a variety of other issues that the Great Society seeks to address. One big area that a lot was accomplished in was education. Johnson and Congress are able to pass the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which increases federal funds to poor school districts. It provides funding for special education, and it expanded on that Head Start program we were talking about a minute ago. They also passed the Higher Education Act in 1965, which provides federal scholarships for education beyond high school. For some people who receive those scholarships, that means four-year colleges, bachelor's degrees. But for others, it's two-year programs, it's vocational training, it's for any education beyond high school. The Bilingual Education Act we've already talked about as a big win for Latino organizers, but that could be considered part of the Great Society. And the Child Nutrition Act in 1966, which added breakfast to the school lunch program to help make sure kids are starting their academic day with the calories that they need to learn all that they can. Maybe the most lasting change to come out of the Great Society is in the area of health insurance. And that's because the Great Society creates two major programs that are still very prominent in American society today, and those are Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is federally provided health insurance for all Americans 65 years and older. So people 65 and older in the United States get some of or all of their health insurance from the federal government via Medicare, and Medicaid, which provides health insurance for poor Americans and disabled Americans. People who maybe can't afford health insurance on their own can get it provided by the federal government through Medicaid. The Great Society also takes big steps to support the arts. The National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities is created as part of the Great Society, and within the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities, two big endowments are set up: the National Endowments for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Both of these are huge amounts of money stored in a bank, and the interest on those accounts are used to fund various programs throughout the year. Artistic projects, scholarly projects, projects approved by the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities subsidize the arts and sciences in America. The Great Society is also responsible for passing the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, which creates the public broadcasting system and the public broadcasting network in the United States, which gives us such programs as Sesame Street. Another area with really significant change from the Great Society was on immigration reform. In 1965, President Johnson signed the Immigration Act of 1965, which abolished that old quota system. It used to matter what country you were coming for when determining whether or not you would be allowed into the United States or whether or not you would be granted U.S. citizenship. Now, after 1965, the only two criteria that are used are what job or work skills do you have and how valuable are those in the current U.S. economy, and do you have family members here in the United States? If so, you're more likely to be admitted to the United States. And as you can see, if you look at the breakdown of immigration in 1960, where 3 out of every 4 immigrants came from Europe, and then in the years following the Immigration Act of 1965, this law has led to a dramatic shift in the people that are coming and admitted to the United States. The Great Society also makes big steps in the area of transportation, one by creating the Department of Transportation, and they're going to increase funding for mass transit, things like buses and trains. They're also going to increase safety regulations on automobiles, and that's a direct response to that book on the right, Unsafe at Any Speed, written by Ralph Nader, that really exposed the dangers and the lack of safety protocols in the automobile industry before the mid-1960s. Finally, the Great Society has major achievements in protecting the environment as well. Clean air and clean water laws are passed, and some of those are passed in response, again, to another book, this one by Rachel Carson, and it's called Silent Spring. Some people consider this book the start of the modern environmentalist movement. LBJ's administration increases the size of federal parks. They increase the number of federal parks. They increase the amount of land set aside as protected wilderness areas as well. Maybe most importantly, the Great Society includes the Endangered Species Protection Act, which identifies species that are threatened or endangered. And it's because of the Endangered Species Protection Act that animals like the bald eagle, which were on the verge of extinction, are able to begin to thrive and really flourish as they do today.